week in the Boardroom. Brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to welcome you what I think will be a very interesting show today. We're going to talk about the board's role in creating value, and we have a great guest to sort of pick this issue apart. Allow me to introduce Nilofer Merchant, who is a director of the Ambassador Group, which is a NASDAQ company that focuses on educational travel. She is known throughout her business career as an innovator, author, and professional speaker. After a heralded career in the tech space, she founded and was CEO of Rubicon Consulting, Inc., a managing consulting company advising global companies on strategic business modeling used for increasing growth and expanding into markets. She is also the author of two recent books on strategy titled The New How, and more recently, 11 Rules for Creating Value in the Social Era. Nilofer, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, we have you here as a director, so the first question I have for you, since you have had all this experience on guiding boards and participating with boards, now, fairly recently, now you sit on a board, okay? So I'd like to know what you think after going on to the other side of the table, what you think that the biggest challenges that directors have, you know, coming in after all your years of experience.
The biggest challenge is knowing that you need to let go of the past. And you know how all of us focus on learning so much and trying to figure out how to get better and better at something. Well, companies do the same thing. They get better and better, and so they build up this muscle memory of, we do this. And then markets change and chaos happens, and we have to figure out how to shift. But what we're not very good at is thinking about how do we unlearn what it is we've sort of taught ourselves is core. And here's the bottom line. Sustainable competitive advantage, that idea that we've all grown up with from B school, used to be 40 years, maybe 30 years. Today, the stat says it's 12 years across all industries and 5 in fast-moving industries, which means anything that we consider to be our domain and our focus area today, we basically have to get nimble enough to leap from opportunity to opportunity instead of perfecting our ability to deliver on that one thing.
Just think of how many companies in the top 20 10 years ago no longer exist, which supports your thought process.
Absolutely.
In your most recent book on creating value in the social era, how does the board fit into the process of creating value?
Yeah, I actually wrote this book and was inspired by it because of a board meeting. And what was going on is I was visiting a board to decide whether or not I wanted to join. And the chairman was talking about how to focus on the core competency, how to shore up the moat around the business, and a series of things that were really about protecting the core. And what I was sitting there thinking is, no, that's like contraindicated. What we need to do is figure out how do we get more fast and fluid and flexible. And in the two worlds in which I've lived in the Fortune 500 world and in the startup land of Silicon Valley, one of the things I've really noticed is there's a set of practices that those that are fast, fluid, and flexible really use. And they were inherently social acts, not social media, the way we sometimes talk about it, but social acts. How do you build partnerships with customers? How do you use non-employees to come co-create value with you? And I was there thinking, this is actually the way that every board should be thinking. How do we actually design our organizational construct to be fast, fluid, and flexible? The analogy I used in the book was, how do we go from being the 800-pound gorilla, which is strong and powerful and valuable, right? But to be more like 800 gazelles, where we're nimble enough to catch the early signal and to leap from opportunity to opportunity. And I think that's going to be the skill every board's got to focus on.
Now, is there any practical exercise that the board, can go through or should be going through to be the gazelle rather than the gorilla?
Yeah, so the fundamental construct is, if you think about social affecting all 9 parts of your business sort of divisions, or you think about how business value is done. Think about how do you use outside resources and collaboration in the marketplace to actually think about how you use HR or distribution or product or sales and marketing. And how we typically think about social is a sales and marketing stuff. Tweet that for me, make sure we have a Facebook presence, etc. And there's actually something else we can do with social, which is what should we build? And I think about IBM, for example, figured out how to do a brain jam in the marketplace, and they asked 2,000 or so students and some of their faculty to participate with them in this brain jam. Here's what happened. They created a product line called Smart Planet that is now affecting 20% of their contribution, 20%, out of this brain jam of ideas. It wasn't IBM and it wasn't the students. It was this shared space that was inherently social about how do we do something really good for the earth that we share together. And then they were able to design new products around it. And that's inherently a social act.
Very cool. You also talk about, both in your speeches and your books, you talk about the benefits of organizing. Mm-hmm. And no group can use more help in organizing than the board as it tries to figure out how it's going to effectively use its time. So how do you bridge that gap, in bringing that skill set to the boardroom?
So one of the things I notice boards, and any leadership group do, but I'm going to talk about boards for a second, is they do this thing where they see an early nascent idea and they say, gosh, that just doesn't seem to scale. And we do scale, right? This is our job, innovation at scale. And they rule out the new idea really fast. Because if you think about Twitter, for example, you and I were just having this conversation before the filming started, it didn't look like it was really important because it looked like people were talking about what are you having for breakfast kind of thing. But it grew to be really an interesting news source, right? And if you ruled it out early, you might never look at it again. And so one of the things I encourage every board to do is think about how, instead of asking a question of, does this scale? Ask, what could this mean for us? After I wrote this, the first piece that ultimately became this book and so on, I had written a piece called Why Porter's Model No Longer Works. And you can imagine being published at Harvard Business Review, saying that pretty bold thing in the headline caused a lot of people to come out of the woodwork of be like, I don't believe you, and challenging the set of ideas I was putting forward. But as we started the conversations, like CEOs would call and corporate directors would call of insurance companies and so on, what they all said was, I sort of believe you and yet I don't, because I don't think anything you're saying scales. And I was like, what is it? I know the general set of ideas I've been talking about, but what is it for you? And how can you dismiss it without even knowing what it is? And I think that's what we've been doing. We've been flipping the logic and focus so much on, does it scale? And not leaving open that door, that aperture for how could this new thing be something we welcome. And I think that's really key to innovation.
Every time we do this show, we're trying to make sure that we give a couple tidbits of advice that people can take away. What are the 2 or 3 things that you would say are the top things that you can offer our viewing audience as far as sort of our general topic of creating value? Yeah.
So one is to think about how do you go from a centralized structure where decisions go sort of up to the top of the chain and back down. That's a relatively slow system. To how do you have more federated decision makers in your business, whether it's a business unit or regional play, but also to just think about how do you share power much more widely through the nodes of the system, and figure out how to know what is it that you actually want to make a decision on, and then let people make that decision, right? That's going to speed up the velocity of the firm and the rate of innovation in the firm and the ability to address all the nuances that are going on close to the market. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to think about what is the way in which we're in relationship with customers. In the book, I talk about this notion of we're going from this notion where brands really had a lot of influence over what they told to the market. And it's not any news to us today that consumers know a lot more back. And so maybe we have to rethink what is the way in which we think about our relationship with our consumers. Are they in charge? And that's sometimes what I see in headlines. I see companies like Nordstrom say, well, our customers are in charge. I'm like, your customer's not in charge, right? That's actually sort of a false premise. And neither are you. And so what is that thing in the middle between the company and its customers. And I've used the analogy of marriage, that I'm not in charge of you if you're my spouse and you're not in charge of me, right? It's the stuff we do together and the way in which we commit to one another and co-create together. That's the stuff in the middle. And so we have to think about our relationship with our market and our buyers and our consumers really in that way, about how do you create something together, and how do I invite you into that process so that you also feel like the thing we did is what you have. Let me just give an example to kind of bring that one home. In the book I write about Sports Authority versus REI. And Sports Authority is a company that is obviously sells quite a bit of sports equipment, but they really don't care about sports based on who they hire, and if you walk around the place, how many people are actually doing sports is a pretty low number, I'm guessing. And yet when you walk into REI, which also sells recreational equipment, you can tell right away that people there actually do the sports. But here's the experience. They'll help you find the backpack by finding out what you really need. They'll help you figure out what map you need, etc. And whether or not you buy from them today is less the point. They actually figure out how to get you really committed to the act of sort of what was your purpose when you walked in the door. And then they use that to hire the right people. They don't think about it as a cashier and an inventory person and so on. Customer service isn't something owned by some little part of marketing. It's owned by every single person in that store, because we're in it together. I want you to fall in love with sports at REI, and therefore I'm going to teach you about sports. And of course you're going to buy from us in the process, but that's the transaction part. The other part is about how do we have a shared context for that conversation.
Well, great advice, and thank you for joining us as the director, even though we'll also call you the author.
Thank you.
And recently published book, 11 Rules for Creating Value in the Social Era. And if you'd like to get a copy of that, you can go to nilofermerchant.com, and there's information that on her philosophies and on her books and on her speaking. And Nilofer, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope that you enjoyed today's session, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week when we'll take on another critical issue that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. And we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.